What if Marvel's most iconic misfits crash and burn again, only this time they take the entire cinematic universe with them? That is not a rhetorical question. That is today's existential crisis for the most successful franchise in modern film history. Welcome to What If Horizons, the podcast that tosses caution to the wind, pours gasoline on your favorite franchises, and lights a match, not out of malice, but because we're professionally curious. And today, we have an inferno brewing. Picture this, it is July 25th, 2025. After years of teases, casting rumors, and enough fan-made posters to wallpaper all of Comic-Con, Marvel finally releases its high-stakes reboot of the Fantastic Four, titled with all the original thinking of a government brochure, Fantastic Four: First Steps. With the kind of confidence only Disney money can buy, Marvel calls it the grand opener to Phase 6, the film that will make us forget every mediocre series on Disney+, every villain with a 0% intimidation factor, and every cameo that felt like contractual obligation dressed as fan service. This was not supposed to be just another superhero movie. It was supposed to be Marvel's resurrection. But what if it is actually its funeral? The signs are already ominous. Critics who got early peeks at the film are using phrases like visually distinct and ambitiously nostalgic, which in the world of film reviews is often polite code for, we do not want to be sued, but this movie has problems. The aesthetic leans into a mid-century retro vibe, complete with Kennedy-era jumpsuits, a family values core, and the kind of color palette that screams Instagram filter. And yes, Galactus is finally here, but in a move that baffles even the most flexible fans, he is voiced by Hugh Grant. Yes, you heard that correctly. Not a booming, cosmic, eldritch monstrosity, but a gently sardonic British man who sounds like he misplaced his tea set. Expectations were stratospheric. After the radioactive failures of the 2005 and 2015 versions, both of which were so critically panned they might as well be in witness protection, this reboot had one job: to not suck. Disney pumped money, time, marketing, and the internet's favorite pretty faces, Joseph Quinn, Vanessa Kirby, Eben Moss-Backrack, and Pedro Pascal, into the mix. If hotness alone could save the multiverse, this film will be the cinematic second coming. But no, not if the writing is flatter than Doom's emotional arc and the jokes feel like ChatGPT wrote them on a bad day. The trailer generated buzz, yes, but it was the kind of buzz where half the comments said, wait, is this real? And the other half asked, why does this feel like a Wes Anderson parody? And still, the studio pressed on, declaring it their boldest reinvention since they gave Thor a midlife crisis and called it character development. Early box office tracking seemed hopeful, predicting a $150 million domestic opening and a $400 million global windfall. The hope was that Marvel fans, long abused by continuity spreadsheets and post-credit scenes that lead nowhere, would crawl back for something familiar, something classic: Reed, Sue, Johnny, and Ben. But what if Marvel forgot that those names no longer mean anything to younger audiences? That Gen Z has never seen a good Fantastic Four movie and likely assumes it is just an old comic book license Marvel refuses to let die. The reboot was framed as foundational. It was to be the keystone of Marvel's next arc, bridging the cosmic, the familial, the multiversal, and whatever remains of their brand credibility. Yet we are now faced with a terrifying alternate possibility that the Fantastic Four do not save the MCU, they sink it. In the first weekend, the numbers are underwhelming. Not catastrophic, but troubling. Reviews call it a mid-tier misfire, praising the cinematography and performances while eviscerating the plot and tone. Twitter, X as Elon insists we call it, erupts in snarky memes comparing Galactus to Paddington Bear. Reddit threads with 4,000 upvotes dissect why the Human Torch feels like he wandered in from an entirely different movie. And the opening monologue from Mr. Fantastic, designed to establish gravitas, becomes a viral audio clip for all the wrong reasons. None of this is hypothetical anymore. If First Steps falters, the reverberations are not just financial, they're philosophical. Marvel, once the titan that dominated culture for a decade, may have to face its most dangerous villain yet, irrelevance. So let us take that thought and run with it. In the next part, we will examine just how high the stakes were, and why this franchise reboot carried the weight of the entire Phase 6 on its slender retro shoulders. But for now, remember, this is not just about one movie failing. This is about the one that could break the spell. And once the spell breaks, there may be no magic left to save the Marvel Cinematic Universe. To understand why Fantastic Four first steps at the ticking time bomb beneath Marvel Studios, we need to rewind the multiverse clock and examine the absurdly fragile state of the Marvel Cinematic Universe going into 2025. What began in 2008 as a scrappy experiment with a metal-suited alcoholic and a barely functional continuity map has since morphed into a sprawling hydra of content, a beast with no head, 3 timelines, and approximately 84 plot threads dangling like loose wires in a wet basement. The once pristine Infinity Saga ended not with a graceful bow, but with an exhausted sigh, leaving behind a fan base divided between those still clinging to theories about Mephisto and those wondering why Ant-Man's third film cost more than the gross domestic product of a small nation. The post-Endgame era has been, to put it generously, a creative minefield. Marvel has staggered through misfires, recasts, production delays, corporate reshuffling, and an oversaturation problem so severe, even lifelong fans began saying words like superhero fatigue and can we just get one movie without a portal in the sky? The golden goose began laying bronze eggs, and Disney's accountants started sweating through their suits. The box office numbers whispered what critics dared not say out loud. The magic was fading. Into this chaos walks a Fantastic Four, a property once so mishandled it became a Hollywood punchline. And yet, paradoxically, they were also viewed as the last best hope for course correction. Why? Because the Fantastic Four were supposed to be elemental. They were Marvel before Marvel was cool. Long before Iron Man quipped his way into cinema history, there was Reed Richards overthinking everything, Sue Storm making invisibility feel like feminism, Johnny Storm being the kind of reckless hothead who would definitely get canceled on social media today, and Ben Grimm grumbling his way through trauma in a trench coat. They were not just characters, they were Marvel's beating heart. The source, the template, the family. So of course the logic went. Reintroducing them would bring back that mythic cohesion, that narrative glue that used to hold everything together. But that logic only works if you actually have something cohesive to attach them to. Instead, what the Fantastic Four have walked into is less of a cinematic universe and more of a genre scrapyard. You have street-level stories that start with noble intent but end in punchlines, multiversal side quests that feel like they were greenlit by algorithm, and villain arcs that dissolve faster than a Loki redemption speech. Kang the Conqueror, supposedly the Thanos of this era, is now surrounded by more real-world controversy than actual menace. The average fan has whiplash. One minute they are in a courtroom comedy with She-Hulk, the next they are watching a grief meditation about Moon Knight's mummy trauma, and then suddenly they are expected to care deeply about Secret Invasion, even though half the characters were replaced by shapeshifters in scenes no one remembers. It is emotional schizophrenia wrapped in spandex. Into this soup, Marvel dumped 4 more characters with baggage, a space-time plot that collapses under its own rules, and a tone that shifts between earnest family drama and ironic detachment. And now we are being asked to believe that this single film, First Steps, will reset the narrative table. Like watching someone plug a toaster into a burning power grid and wondering why breakfast is not working out. The problem is not just the film. The problem is that Marvel no longer knows what kind of story it is telling. Is it a franchise? A soap opera? A cosmic fable? A sketch show? And when you do not know what story you are telling, even the strongest characters fall flat. Reed Richards becomes a walking exposition machine, Sue Storm an underwritten mom trope, Johnny Storm a Gen Z TikTok influencer in denial, and Ben Grimm the token tragic muscle who delivers the same 2 lines in 5 emotional flavors. Audiences are not dumb. They can smell desperation through Dolby surround sound. And desperation is exactly what First Steps radiates. The fan service is clinical. The plot progression is so engineered it might as well have barcodes. It's not just that the film fails to rescue the MCU, it is that it exposes how far gone the patient already is. That even a foundational reboot cannot save a machine that no longer knows why it is running. Next, we will explore the business side of this disaster. The money, the stakeholders, and the panicked executives wondering if maybe they should have let the X-Men go first. But for now, let us sit with this uncomfortable truth. When you make a movie to save a universe and that movie fails, what you are left with is not just a box office flop. What you are left with is a shared delusion breaking in real time. And no amount of cosmic radiation can heal that. If Part 2 sounded like a dramatic critique of storytelling gone astray, Part 3 is where we rip off the financial mask and expose the panic face behind the curtain. The producers, executives, and investor class who somehow thought a film called First Steps would single-handedly stabilize a multi-billion-dollar cinematic empire built on the fragile backs of increasingly confused audiences. When Marvel Studios placed the Fantastic Four in pole position for the next phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the decision was not just creative, it was financial desperation in a cape. Bob Iger's return to Disney throne had sent a clear message: return on investment or return to unemployment. Streaming services had bloated content pipelines beyond recognition. Cinema revenues were plateauing like a dead ECG, and even merchandise sales were seeing more dust and shelf movement. Marvel needed a hit, and not just any hit, it needed a messianic hit. A film that would not only draw crowds, but also resurrect faith. And that is a lot to put on four people who once battled a cloud-shaped Galactus. The budget for Fantastic Four First Steps hovered somewhere north of $200 million, not including marketing, reshoots, or the now standard "we will fix it" in post-production when the VFX team wakes up from their collective burnout coma costs. That means this film had to earn close to $600 million just to break even, and that was considered conservative. But Marvel and Disney were not worried because they still believed in the cult of brand loyalty. They believed that even if audiences were tired of superhero content, they would still line up for the right nostalgia, the right Easter egg, the right multiverse cameo. They thought adding the Fantastic Four was like bringing a classic band back together after a 20-year hiatus. Everyone would show up, cry a little, and buy the t-shirt. What they forgot is that the audience had aged, the band had never really played a hit in the first place, and nostalgia without substance is just emotional debt. Internally, the studio played a game of risk mitigation dressed up as optimism. They brought in a director who had publicly promised a grounded human approach to cosmic storytelling, which is executive speak for, "we have no idea what tone to hit, so we are hedging." They hired screenwriters who had previously worked on one successful family drama and one streaming series canceled after season 1, because nothing says universe-defining blockbuster like hiring writers who are still updating their LinkedIn pages. Focus groups were held. Data was mined. Storyboards were built like military strategy maps. And through it all, Marvel clung to a singular delusion that the Fantastic Four brand itself was strong enough to overcome audience apathy, that enough people had fond memories of the comic books, that enough people remembered the characters from previous failures without actually associating them with those failures. What they did not factor in is that the modern moviegoer is no longer loyal to characters. They're loyal to coherence, to vision, to meaning. And the Marvel Cinematic Universe had slowly bled all three of those qualities dry. As opening weekend approached, marketing went into overdrive. Trailers flooded social media platforms, teaser posters appeared on the sides of buses, and digital campaigns promised that this would be the Marvel event that redefined everything. Leaks were accidentally dropped to tease a secret cameo that might or might not involve mutants, Deadpool, or a variant version of Iron Man, played by an actor who had once called superhero movies theme parks for the intellectually idle. There was a desperate hum beneath the hype, a frantic energy like someone trying to sell life insurance during an earthquake. And then the reviews hit. Not catastrophic, not unwatchable, but deeply underwhelming. Critics said the film felt like an apology with good lighting, or a PowerPoint presentation rendered in high resolution. Audience scores were polite but tepid. No one hated it, but no one loved it. And that, more than any scathing Rotten Tomatoes blurb, is what doomed it, because Marvel had already burned through goodwill. It had no emotional savings account left. It needed a miracle and instead got a C+. Internally, studio heads began backpedaling before Monday morning. Plans for a trilogy became plans for a possible sequel depending on overseas performance. The interconnected storylines meant to blossom from this film began quietly vanishing from development slates. And the accountants, those uncredited gods of the film industry, started filing reports that used words like write-down and content impairment. Part 3 ends with a bitter lesson. If you spend 2 decades building a cultural empire on serialized storytelling and cross-media synergy, then every film becomes a referendum on the whole structure. You do not just risk a box office miss. You risk unraveling the very myth that keeps your brand breathing. Up next in Part 4, we dive into the wreckage, how the film's failure ripples outward into upcoming Marvel projects, causing delays, cancellations, and a slow, brutal reshuffling of an entire phase that was already written in pencil. So the curtain fell, And what remained was not just a poorly received film, but a smoking crater where Marvel's phase strategy used to be. With Fantastic Four First Steps failing to ignite even a small bonfire of excitement, the carefully structured domino trail of interconnected Marvel Cinematic Universe projects began toppling like a drunken parade of Jenga towers. At first, the language from Marvel Studios was surgical and vague, the kind of corporate speech designed to imply strength while admitting quiet failure. Creative realignment, fan-centered recalibration, and opportunity to slow down and focus on quality over quantity. These phrases rolled off press releases like they were generated by a chatbot trained on shareholder panic. The internal calendar, once a proud fortress of release dates stretching into the late 2030s, began to implode under the weight of uncertainty. The next film, previously codenamed Quantum Paradox, allegedly a sequel to a sequel of a prequel, involving a lesser-known cosmic hero who once appeared in a Disney Plus side project, was suddenly postponed for further development. That meant its scripts were not salvageable. The director had quietly left the project, and the studio was no longer confident anyone would care. Other titles fell into a similar abyss. Young Avengers, once billed as the fresh blood infusion to reignite youth interest, was now quietly missing from investor slides. Secret Wars, the supposed Avengers-level climax of his era, had become a question mark the size of a moon. Even Deadpool meets the Multiverse, a film that practically marketed itself, was rumored to be undergoing significant rewrites to distance itself from the narrative consequences of a failed Fantastic Four. Because in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, one weak link does not just break the chain, it snaps the whole multiversal rope bridge and sends everything plummeting into irrelevance. But it was not just the movies. The streaming shows began to suffer collateral damage. Wanda's Ghosts, Kang's Origins, The Skrull Divorce Court, and all the other projects that sounded like rejected comic spin-offs suddenly found their budgets halved, their episode counts shortened, or their timelines erased altogether. Cast members began posting cryptic emojis on social media, publicists went quiet, and agents started circulating resumes to non-superhero franchises. For Disney, the implications were even more dire. The company had leaned into Marvel content not as an artistic endeavor, but as a renewable financial engine. Theme park attractions, merchandise lines, corporate tie-ins, with everything from fast food to credit cards. All of it depended on sustained excitement. But when excitement turned to confusion and confusion to exhaustion, the revenue did not just slow, it decayed. Shop shelves groaned under unsold action figures of characters who only appeared for 30 seconds in a mid-credit scene. Limited edition posters became unlimited clearance bin fillers. Children could no longer remember which hero was which or why a movie about stretchy people mattered after a decade of omnipotent purple gods. Internally, Disney's boardrooms began to fracture. One faction argued for a return to basics, less interconnection, smaller stories, maybe even recasting the whole universe and starting over. Another group insisted on waiting out the storm, pointing to overseas markets, algorithmic projections, and the idea that audiences are fickle but forgivable. A third, more radical group reportedly floated the nuclear option, selling Marvel Studios entirely and focusing on princesses, talking animals, and the one Pixar idea that has not been milked yet. Meanwhile, competitors watched like vultures with popcorn. Warner Brothers, having spent the last 10 years hurling various DC properties at the wall like cooked spaghetti, now saw an opening. Maybe it was time to soft reboot Batman again, or greenlight 12 Joker spin-offs, or revisit the idea of a shared universe held together by sarcasm and eyeliner. Even the smaller studios, those long frozen out of the superhero craze, suddenly found themselves emboldened. Maybe audiences wanted something new, something weird, something not requiring a 3-hour YouTube explainer before entering the cinema. Part 4 closes with a poetic irony. The failure of Fantastic Four First Steps was not just the stumble of one film. It was a mirror held up to a genre that had stopped asking whether it was still welcome. For over 15 years, superhero films had dominated not because they were flawless, but because they were fun, fresh, and fundamentally knew what they were. Once they forgot that and started chasing complexity over clarity, universes over stories, they became vulnerable. In the next part, we explore how Marvel tried to rally, launching emergency projects, desperate casting announcements, and hollow promises of reinvention. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. When a behemoth begins to bleed, it does not quietly patch itself in the dark. No, it throws a parade of distractions. That was the Marvel strategy in the months following the collapse of Fantastic Four First Steps, a frenzied, glitter-drenched scramble to convince the world it still had a plan. Suddenly, every entertainment headline screamed about Marvel's bold new era, though none could say what exactly was bold or new, except for a rebranding effort that added neon lines to the studio logo and vaguely promised stories you have never imagined. Apparently, that meant throwing every name still under contract in the last-minute announcements. Remember the actor who played the telepathic janitor in the background of Doctor Strange in the Temporal Kitchen Sink? He was now leading a trilogy. Did the raccoon sidekick from Guardians of the Galaxy mention a cousin once? Well, guess what? There was now a 6-part streaming series about their intergalactic childhood trauma. It was as if a panic button had been slapped so hard, it activated every backup project conceived during late-night pitch meetings fueled by caffeine and fear. The most infamous attempt to recover was Project Reignite, a massive, all-hands-on-deck initiative involving surprise cameos, multiverse twists, and narrative glue so artificial it should have come with a health warning. Robert Downey Jr.'s face was rumored to be digitally resurrected using unused Iron Man footage and a budget that could solve several small national deficits. Hugh Jackman was offered a blank check and a lifetime supply of protein shakes to reprise Wolverine in a storyline that did not quite explain why he was now leading the Avengers. Meanwhile, trailers began flooding the internet with such frequency and desperation that one fan counted 5 major teasers released in a single week, 3 of which contradicted each other. In the vacuum of actual story substance, Marvel leaned to meta-humor. Posters started calling themselves the comeback phase. One trailer narrated its own trailer, as if self-awareness could somehow erase fatigue. But the audience was not buying it. Literally. Ticket pre-sales for Multiverse Midlife Crisis, one of the emergency crossover projects, were so low that some cinemas tried pairing it with free popcorn, parking, and therapy. Critics, once cautiously diplomatic about Marvel missteps, now wield its sarcasm like a lightsaber. A film as dense as a dying star and twice as emotionally vacant, read one review. Another asks, is it still fan service if the fans no longer want it? The most damning moment came when a mid-credit scene, meant to reveal the next big villain, was met with audible laughter in theaters, not because it was funny, but because it was so obviously desperate. This was a villain tease for 4 years, built up through glances and cryptic dialogue, now reduced to a 2-minute monologue that sounded like it was stitched together from rejected motivational posters. Audiences had evolved, or perhaps simply sobered up. The genre that once promised escape now felt like homework. You needed charts, memory, and a tolerance for digital sludge to follow it all. The average viewer, once thrilled to catch Easter eggs and debate theories, was now exhausted by homework disguised as entertainment. And the core truth Marvel tried so hard to ignore began whispering louder. People no longer trusted the promise that it would all eventually make sense. Because what if it would not? What if all the setup, the teases, the universe building amounted to nothing more than a slow, expensive spiral into incoherence? In Part 6, we will dig into how audiences began revolting, not with fire and pitchforks, but with wallets closed, voices raised, and hashtags that trended not because they were hopeful, but because they were done. There is a peculiar kind of protest that requires no marching, no shouting, no picket signs. It is the silent rebellion of the modern audience, the kind that unfolds with a shrug and a tap on the unsubscribe button. After the collapse of Fantastic Four, First Steps, this quiet mutiny reached critical mass. Streaming numbers dipped like a stock chart during a financial scandal. Theater seats were so empty that some cinemas resorted to cardboard cutouts just to create the illusion of life. A Marvel premiere used to feel like a global holiday. Now it felt like someone accidentally uploaded the wrong file and hoped no one would notice. Fans, once the most loyal cult outside organized religion, began defecting en masse. These were not casual viewers. These were the diehards who once dressed as obscure characters and wrote 1,000-word essays on forum threads dissecting whether a single line of dialogue from a side character confirmed an alternate timeline. Even they had had enough. The breaking point was not a single moment, but a relentless drizzle of disappointment that soaked through the thickest nostalgia raincoat. For some, it was the bait-and-switch marketing that promised world-shaking consequences but delivered sitcom-level stakes. For others, it was the bloated runtimes padded with exposition delivered by characters who looked as tired as the actors portraying them. But the real betrayal was emotional. These stories had once meant something. They inspired, thrilled, sometimes even healed. Now they felt like algorithmic churn, content rather than cinema, a factory line of soulless spectacle. The hashtags told the story better than any critic could. Hashtag Marvel fatigue trended for days. Has let it rest was a plea, not a suggestion. One fan-created meme showed a skeleton still waiting for the tease payoff from a 2023 post-credit scene. And perhaps most telling was hashtag Remember Phase 3, a digital graveyard of longing for a time when the Marvel machine still knew where it was going and why. Studio executives responded in the only language they knew, denial mixed with marketing. "We hear our fans," they said, while greenlighting 17 new projects and announcing a crossover between Ant-Man's cousin and the Ghost of Ultron. They promised smaller, character-driven stories right before launching a $250 million space opera starring a CGI moon. At fan conventions, even the applause felt hesitant, like clapping at a retirement party where no one wanted to say the guest of honor had already left the building. The merchandise aisles at retail stores began to collect dust. Toys that once sold out within hours now languished on clearance shelves beside forgotten cereal mascots. Children, once eager to wield plastic hammers and shields, had moved on to newer obsessions. The cultural throne Marvel once occupied was being eyed by rivals more agile, more daring, and far less burdened by their own lore. Indie science fiction and horror made a comeback. International cinema, once peripheral, now took center stage. Eerie and nostalgic revivals from rival studios began to feel fresher, as if Marvel's decline was nourishing everything around it with valuable cautionary lessons. The final straw, ironically, came not from a film but from a streaming poll. Marvel, in a display of tone-deaf optimism, asked fans to vote on which character deserved a spin-off next. The top response was none. Let them rest. It was not bitter, just weary. Like an audience that had loved too much for too long and now simply wished to be left alone to mourn what once was. In Part 7, we explore the chain reaction outside the Marvel bubble, how rival studios pounced, the superhero genre fractured, and the very idea of cinematic universes began to collapse under the weight of their own ambition. The collapse of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was not a vacuum implosion. It was a seismic event that shook every corner of the entertainment industry, sending waves through studios, franchises, and boardrooms that had spent the past decade imitating the formula with the faith of medieval alchemists. As Fantastic Four first steps belly flopped with cinematic clumsiness, rival studios smelled opportunity like sharks in the water, except the blood was spilled nostalgia and wounded intellectual property. Warner Brothers, long the fumbling sibling in the superhero family, attempted a triumphant return to relevance. With Marvel wounded, it was now or never. They announced a surprise reboot of their own cinematic universe for the third time in 12 years. In a desperate bid for differentiation, they marketed it as gritty but joyful, a phrase so contradictory it could only have come from a committee locked in a room with marketing buzzwords and no lunch. They launched a 3-hour film starring a sad but hopeful Aquaman who battles climate change and his own trust issues. Audience response was polite confusion. Sony, never one to miss a trend it barely understands, greenlit 8 Spider-Man adjacent projects in a single week. One focused on the inner life of Aunt May's cat. Another explored the tax fraud trial of the Oscorp board of directors. Viewers began to wonder if studios had mistaken cinematic world building for an endless Wikipedia rabbit hole. Streaming platforms were even more shameless. They announced crossover events before the characters had even debuted. One particularly cursed project attempted to merge a detective drama, a teen musical, and a post-apocalyptic survival series into a single universe held together by a common antagonist named Jeff. Jeff was a talking crow with anxiety, but the real shockwave hit within the superhero genre itself. Suddenly, nothing was sacred. Legacy heroes were reimagined faster than they could be trademarked. Batman was now a social media recluse solving crimes on TikTok. Superman renounced his powers in favor of organic farming and podcasting. Thor hosted a Nordic cooking show on a premium app that cost more than most gym memberships. The term cinematic universe began to lose its luster. Audiences, once dazzled by interconnected storylines, now sighed audibly at the first mention of a shared multiverse. The word crossover became a warning sign, like flashing hazard lights before a bad merge. Writers and directors who had spent years trying to sneak originality into pre-approved Marvel templates suddenly found themselves free to tell one-off stories, to kill characters without corporate approval, to end movies without teaser trailers for a sequel that would be canceled anyway. Some of the best storytelling of the decade emerged in this strange new climate. Bold, weird, unapologetically standalone films started popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. They did not promise cinematic universes. They promised endings. Audiences wept in gratitude, and then came the inevitable backlash against the backlash. A small but vocal group of fans launched a campaign called Reassemble. They wanted the Marvel Universe back. All of it. The good, the bad, the incoherent. They saw the failure of Fantastic Four First Steps not as a death, but as a betrayal, a failure of execution, not concept. They argued that the Marvel world had been mismanaged, not flawed. Petition after petition demanded a soft reboot, a spiritual reset, a back-to-basics arc. Studio executives listened, but not in the way fans hoped. What they heard was not a call for storytelling. They heard brand loyalty. They heard potential merchandise, and thus began what came to be known as the zombie phase. In Part 8, we enter the undead years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where nothing could die, no idea was too expired, and the franchise shambled on, half alive, fully confused, and desperately trying to remember what made it human. The zombie phase began not with a thunderous announcement, but with a whisper of desperation. The executives at Marvel Studios are now under a boardroom regime that rotated faster than Spider-Man's web reloads, unveiled their plan, a resurrection of the brand through digital necromancy. Rather than reboot, refresh, or reimagine, they decided to reanimate. Every character, every storyline, every universe, no matter how conclusively ended, was brought back into circulation through the dark magic of algorithmic content generation. Iron Man returned via artificial intelligence-generated hologram performances stitched together from old voice samples and deep fake footage. His lines, devoid of soul or timing, sounded like a motivational podcast hosted by a haunted espresso machine. Captain America, last seen retired and happy, was dragged back into battle by an alternate timeline loophole so convoluted that even the scriptwriter admitted defeat in the footnotes. Black Widow starred in a limited series that took place between two heartbeats in a film from 7 years earlier. It was marketed as a character deep dive, but played like a contractual obligation dressed in spy leather. Audiences watched with a mix of nostalgia and mild horror. The special effects were impressive, the continuity references relentless, but something was missing, namely emotion, cohesion, and the vague sensation that someone involved actually cared. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was now powered not by creativity but inertia. Stories were selected not based on passion or vision, but by trending hashtags, search engine optimization, and regional data analytics. One entire series was greenlit because the phrase Doctor Strange Mumbai spiked briefly on social media due to a viral meme about Korean portals. Another was written by a chatbot trained on decades of Marvel comics and 300 hours of Reddit debates. Its plot featured 6 variations of Loki trying to out-sarcasm each other while searching for an artifact shaped like a USB stick containing the meaning of life. It was called the Low-Key War and somehow ran for 4 seasons. Viewership declined steadily, but the merchandise numbers were strong. Even the audience began to resemble the undead. Marvel fans trudged through each release not with excitement but obligation. They watched every show, not because they enjoyed them, but because they feared missing a plot point that might be referenced 2 years later in a post-credit scene. It was not entertainment, it was homework. Film critics coined the term fan fatigue syndrome. Viewers developed symptoms such as trailer nausea, cameo anxiety, and multiverse migraines. Popcorn sales fell while aspirin sales soared. Meanwhile, the actors became prisoners of their own digitally scanned likenesses. Their contracts now included clauses for posthumous performances, ensuring that even in death, they could still appear in promotional tie-ins and mobile game cutscenes. Samuel L. Jackson once joked that he would still be playing Nick Fury from the grave. He did not know how right he would be. Somewhere between the 5th Young Avengers recast and the 3rd retcon of the timeline, the magic finally died. There was no cataclysm, no final battle, no noble farewell. Just a slow, quiet realization that the audience had left. Not angrily, not dramatically, just silently. They stopped watching. They stopped caring. They moved on. In the vast emptiness left behind, the Marvel Cinematic Universe continued to churn, like a theme park ride abandoned in the desert, still playing the same music on loop to no one. In Part 9, we will explore what happened when Marvel Studios finally pulled the plug, and what rose from the ashes of the multiverse's most profitable collapse. The unplugging of the Marvel Cinematic Universe did not come with fanfare or finality. It came quietly, like a notification you forgot to check before your phone died. The executives, now battered by quarterly reports that resembled haunted obituaries, held one last press conference via live stream, 3 marketing managers in wrinkle-resistant suits, each blinking furiously as if trying to remember which cinematic timeline they were in. The announcement was simple. No more phases. No more spin-offs. No more universe. They called it a creative hiatus, a phrase corporate lawyers adore because it sounds like inspiration but functions like euthanasia. Social media responded with a collective shrug and a flurry of memes. Some expressed relief. Others held funerals for their fan accounts. A few diehards insisted the silence was just a setup for an epic surprise comeback. It was not. The servers shut down. The merchandise dried up. Theme park attractions were rebranded to generic superpower adventures, and for the first time in 17 years, no new Marvel content was released. That is when the void truly made itself known. The entertainment landscape, once saturated by capes, laser beams, and time paradoxes, now faced an existential crisis. Streaming platforms panicked. Pop culture blogs imploded. Convention centers stood awkwardly empty. The cosplay industry attempted a pivot to historical reenactment, but failed when attendees demanded a crossover between Napoleon and Darth Vader. There was, briefly, a series of documentaries exploring the cultural impact of Marvel. Most were narrated in hushed tones, as if chronicling a lost civilization. Experts debated whether the downfall was inevitable or merely self-inflicted. The truth, of course, lay somewhere in between, a tale of creative exhaustion, audience overload, and the lethal assumption that success is infinite. But nature and capitalism abhors a vacuum. Into the space once occupied by Marvel rushed a new generation of content, scrappier, stranger, occasionally coherent. Independent studios began producing superhero films again, but now with budgets that could not afford spandex. One surprise hit featured a middle-aged librarian who discovers he can control squirrels. It was shot on location at an actual library and became an underground success, not because of spectacle, but sincerity. Elsewhere, the cinematic multiverse gave way to what critics called the single-verse movement, stories that took place in one world with one cast and concluded within one runtime. Audiences, it turned out, had missed endings. Marvel's collapse also had geopolitical effects. Several countries had invested heavily in themed infrastructure based on now-defunct franchises. A Marvel-themed cruise ship was converted into a floating museum of hubris. In Dubai, a half-finished Star Tower experience became a squatter's haven and eventually a TikTok-famous skate park. And then came the memoirs. Directors, actors, producers all suddenly rediscovered the value of perspective. One former star described the Marvel machine as a well-lit gulag with catering. Another admitted he only signed on because he thought he was playing a serious wizard, not a guy named Quantum Greg. Some turned to theater. Others disappeared entirely. Robert Downey Jr. opened the Vineyard. Chris Evans became a professional woodworker. Tom Holland retired at 32 and founded a non-profit for child stunt doubles. Kevin Feige, the architect of it all, reportedly bought a cabin in Oregon and now teaches screenwriting to confused elk. Still, the legacy of Marvel remained, not in the content, but in the cultural muscle memory it left behind. References lingered. Phrases endured. Children still dressed as Thor for Halloween. Although some began to ask who he was, Marvel, in its prime, had been a mythology factory. Its failure was not a tragedy. It was a necessary ending. But as history has shown, mythologies have a habit of returning when least expected. And that brings us to the final, what if, after all the ashes and silence, someone tries to restart the whole thing again? It begins, as all dangerous ideas do, in a conference room, somewhere in Burbank, or perhaps a tech-forward basement in Cupertino. A junior executive with a passion for risk and an allergy to cultural memory pulls out a binder labeled Marvel Reboot Initiative. The pages inside are glossy, filled with terms like IP leverage, cross-brand optimization, and the phrase that sends shivers down any sentient viewer's spine, Phase Zero. There is a new pitch. Not a sequel, not a remake, a reimagining. The Fantastic Four are now a street dance crew in 1980s New York with elemental powers and a mission to save the Bronx from interdimensional gentrification. Dr. Doom is a misunderstood urban planner. Reed Richards is an MIT dropout with ADHD and an Instagram cooking channel. The Human Torch is a TikTok influencer with flame effects powered by crypto. And Sue Storm? She has a PhD in quantum feminism and teaches invisibility as a metaphor for underrepresentation. The new film is called Fantastic Four: Rise and Grime. It is approved. Fast Track. The director is 27 and describes his vision as half Goddard, half Fortnite. The first teaser drops during the Super Bowl. Reactions are: half the internet screams betrayal, the other half screams irony. Studio executives interpret this as engagement. Merchandise is ordered. Theme park rebranding resumes. The newly hired head of cinematic strategy gives a keynote speech titled "Why Storytelling is Overrated." Critics try to resist, but soon their feeds are flooded with influencer junkets and branded hoodies. A new streaming deal is announced. 32 interlocking shows will build toward an eventual crossover event called Secret Gentrification. A former Marvel actor tweets good luck, followed by a cryptic frog emoji. The hype cycle spins like a turbine. No one notices the ghost of Kevin Feige shaking his head from his Oregon porch. In classrooms, professors sigh as they rewrite syllabi to include the new golden age of IP revitalization. And just like that, we are back. The wheel turns. The cycle reboots. Marvel is not dead. It is undead. An idea too big to bury, too familiar to forget, too profitable to ignore. Like a cinematic zombie, it rises not with screens, but with spreadsheets. And so we must ask, what have we learned? Perhaps that no franchise is truly immortal, but all can be resurrected if there's enough nostalgia and insufficient memory. Perhaps that we, the audience, are not consumers but addicts, always itching for that next dopamine hit of fan service wrapped in a spandex suit. Or perhaps most dangerously, we have learned nothing at all. But whatever your conclusion, dear listener, know this: the next time you see a teaser trailer that begins with a slow piano version of a 1990s pop song and ends with a glowing logo you thought was retired, remember this podcast. Remember that this has all happened before. And unless someone stops the intern with the binder, it will all happen again. Thank you for listening to What If Horizons, where speculative fiction meets cinematic autopsy. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, and maybe send a heartfelt message to your nearest exhausted screenwriter. Because if we do not learn from the fall of Marvel, the next Fantastic Four might just be singing. Until next time, imagine harder.